In this podcast, I have the pleasure to host Dr. Ian Gleser, Vice President at the German Marshall Fund in Brussels, to discuss Russia's invasion in Ukraine and the many changes that brought in our lives. Thank you, Dr. Gleser, for being with us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation.
You said recently that the West doesn't want to poke the Russian bear, and most importantly, that we have yet to come to grips with the utter ruthlessness of Russian policy. Is the West making a mistake, do you think, by not getting more involved? And in reality, what is more without starting a war with Russia?
Well, the truth is, I think that the West, if we want to use that term, is really very, very fully involved. There is more that can be done, obviously, but in terms of arms being sent to Ukraine, in terms of financial support for Ukraine, in terms of sanctions of a very sweeping kind that have been put in place as a result of the invasion of Ukraine, and maybe above all, really, because it's the engine of much of this, the sort of moral engagement of societies on both sides of the Atlantic in support of the Ukrainian cause. So, I think actually the truth is the West is deeply involved in this, is very fully a stakeholder. We could talk about some other things that could be done and the risks associated with them, though.
You also said that in the New York Times, actually, that the level of risk for NATO has simply and suddenly increased enormously. So do you believe that we are entering an even more dangerous phase than the Cold War, where war will be an everyday danger for all of us if something happens?
I think we've already entered that period, actually. When I think about this, some people sometimes say that this is the most serious security crisis in Europe since, in a generation. It's true, but it's not telling you the full story. In fact, I think this is the most serious security crisis in Europe, or even facing the West, since 1945. And I say that not because there weren't other crises, some of them in Europe, in the Balkans, for example, but because they didn't have the scale, they weren't as existential for the West as a whole, and they didn't involve nuclear weapons. The irony here, I think, is that the relationship between the Soviet Union and the West during the Cold War was much more stable and much safer at a certain level than the relationship we have with Russia today. If you'll allow me a little anecdote, I spent many years working at the Rand Corporation in California at the very end of the Cold War, and at a time when nuclear strategy and arms control were big topics with then Soviet Union. And we had constant interactions with opposite numbers in the Soviet Union. We didn't always agree, but we basically understood what was stabilizing, what was destabilizing. They understood us. We more or less understood them. Today, we don't have any of that. Today, we have big question marks when we think about what Russia wants. They have obviously big question marks about understanding what the West is doing and what the West wants. And we don't have all of the mechanisms that existed to make a very, very dangerous situation somewhat safer. So the risk of something going wrong and escalating, I think it's much more serious today than it's been really since 1945.
So is there something very vital that all these years, we haven't understood about Vladimir Putin? It's like we, and when I say we, I mean the West, NATO, United States, Canada, European Union, Germany, of course, talked with Vladimir Putin, but in reality, we didn't listen carefully to him and what he was saying for many, many years. Is that true? Did we lose something in all these years about deeply understanding Russia and its leader?
I think there probably is something to that. And it's also possible that his own thinking evolved over time. That he's somehow thinking in some strange way about his legacy and has been pushed towards more aggressive actions in the last decade, really, as a result of that. Hard to know. I mean, we are in an atmosphere at the moment, an environment where, our intelligence is very good about certain things. We can see everything that happens on the ground. We can listen to lots of things. We have an enormous amount of information. What we can't always discern is the intentions of leaderships. What's going on in a leader's head. And maybe there that goes to your question, because I think we had a tendency to think of Russia somehow as a system, even if it wasn't democratic in the sense that our systems are, at least it was a system. It wasn't simply one person's whim. But I think what we've seen over the last weeks and months shows that overwhelmingly it is one person's whim.
Now there is also the factor of the Chinese. They are in a tight spot also, as are we, of course, because on one hand, we see that they feel very, very close to Russia, and we will see how that evolves, and I want your opinion. Otherwise, they are also very involved with the West in a financial way, and maybe not only that. So do you think that Beijing, China, will take a clear-cut pro-stance, pro-Russian stance, whatever that will mean in its relationships with the West?
I think China is going to continue to try to walk this difficult path between, philosophical support in a way and practical support with Russia. After all, there is a kind of systemic interest there in seeing the West with less influence, with individual, to their view, like-minded powers with more influence in the world on a national basis, Russia, China. They would like to add to that others in the global South. I'm not sure if they'll be successful. On the other hand, as you say, they have a systemic stake in the stability of the international economic system, in the stability of their trade and investment relationships with the West. Russia is very much a junior partner when it comes to the relationship between China and Russia, especially in economic terms. They also have a different view about time and strategy. It's a commonplace to say that the Chinese are really thinking in very long-term fashion, that they have, as they say, strategic patience. I'm sure that's true, but I think this is perhaps most dramatically illustrated in relation to Russia. I mean, Russia is a declining power in a hurry, if you ask me, and I'm sure that's evident to the Chinese as well. China is playing a very long game with the United States and with everyone else, and I don't think they want to see this long game disturbed by rogue actions coming from Moscow. So I think they have every interest in, as much as they would like to see themselves in a more dominant position in the future vis-a-vis the West, they have every interest in seeing this conflict contained.
So another country that is trying to balance itself on a tightrope is Turkey. She's clearly also pro-Ukraine. She has sent also arms, not exactly arms, but arm equipment, I can say that. And she also has very good relations with Russia and Vladimir Putin. She has not imposed sanctions, and now she had in Istanbul the Ukrainian and Russians to talk in the negotiations. Do you think that Turkey can continue like that? I mean, having, as we say, one foot in one boat and the other in the other boat. Is it possible?
Well, as this goes on, the longer it lasts, the more difficult that balancing act becomes, I think. Turkey is, of course, a stakeholder in this, in regional security terms, but also economic terms. Turkey is present as a power in the Black Sea. It has, as you say, a relationship with Russia, which includes its own defense imports from Russia, obviously, but it also has exported materials to Ukraine. It has an economic relationship, a commercial relationship with both countries, more so with Russia, but some with Ukraine. It has energy stakes, many points of engagement for Turkey in this crisis. And I think also President Erdogan, probably at this point, with his eye on an election coming up next year, sees something to be gained from being at least a facilitator in the diplomacy that is going on at the moment between Ukraine and Russia. But the longer this goes on, the more difficult this will become for Turkey, I think, because the more insecure the environment around Turkey is, the more it's going to matter that Turkey comes back and solidifies its relationship with traditional NATO allies. And that's something that they have their eye on, I'm sure, but they would like to play a more independent role, but that's going to get harder and harder, I think, as this conflict conflict evolves. Certainly the question about sanctions is going to be particularly difficult for Turkey because over time, historically, they've been, if I could say, allergic to sanctions. They're under sanctions themselves, in fact. They're not likely to impose sanctions, and they might even be a way for Russia to evade some forms of sanctions. This obviously is not going to sit well with Turkey's Western partners. And as much as Turkey at the moment might want to revitalize its relationship with Washington and with Brussels, that's going to be harder to do if Turkey isn't on the same page when it comes to sanctions.
About the Greek-Turkish relations, do you think that we saw the Turkish president and Greek prime minister had the meeting in Istanbul, and the two countries, Athens and Ankara, talk? Do you think that the war in Ukraine could be something that helps Greece and Turkey coming closer again after so many years that there's big frictions, and we worry all the time about what's happening in Aegean, in the Eastern Mediterranean?
Well, exactly. I mean, it's a good question. I think it's true that in most recent years, there's been a revival of tension in the Eastern Mediterranean, which has been of real concern to Athens and to Greek partners. I would say that the return to something of a détente between Athens and Ankara actually started before the war in Ukraine. But you could argue that as the security environment as a whole becomes more stressful, in a way for both countries, but especially for Turkey, that the Western ties, the alliance ties, the need to keep regional disputes, local disputes, bilateral disputes under control will be more prominent in the policy from Ankara. So I think, yes, and there will be specific opportunities perhaps where the two countries can work together. There was this proposal, perhaps for Turkey and Greece, together with some others to act, with France, I believe, to actually, or perhaps Italy, to go and to try to provide a kind of multilateral relief operation at sea for Mariupol. And that apparently was rejected by the Russians. But you could see just the idea that such a thing could be on the table is interesting.
Well, getting back to Ukraine and Russia, is there a way out of this crisis? I mean, in politics and in diplomacy, of course, there is always a way, but this is a way for Vladimir Putin to get out of this without losing face. And do you believe that we got where we are because of what NATO and what the West tried to do, or maybe humiliate Russians after 1989, after when the Soviet Union didn't exist anymore? Or that it is a matter of what Putin really believes, that he doesn't believe that he could have near him an independent and sovereign and democratic Ukraine, that is the threat to him. And in reality, he didn't feel threatened either by NATO or by the European Union, but by having near him a Ukraine that he doesn't believe should be democratic and should believe and shouldn't be also independent.
Well, in a way, the thread that runs through all of these questions is, regime survival as seen by Vladimir Putin. I mean, the question of whether he is looking for an exit from what is so far really a failed military strategy in Ukraine on the whole, it becomes much more dramatic for him precisely because of that, because of the assumption, and that may or may not be true, but the assumption we're making that if somehow he cannot come out of this war in Ukraine with something he can hold up as a victory to the Russian people, that the security of his regime is going to be affected. I think that's probably true, but then he's surprised us in a lot of other ways, and his ability to redefine things and to change the narrative in ways that support his position in power, is demonstrated. And so we'll have to see. Clearly, there are some indications that he's looking for that kind of a redefinition of war aims that will allow him to back off from this very forward strategy. But it's not at all clear yet. There are ways he could still continue to try to escalate, as they like to say, escalate to de-escalate, which is a rather frightening notion. but he might yet go that path. In terms of the history, well, again, it's hard to understand his psyche precisely, but clearly he has in his mind the idea that he can be the one to reestablish Russia's rightful role, not only in Eurasia, but in world affairs. My own view is that NATO enlargement itself didn't play a big role in this, objectively. But he's not looking at this in objective terms. Is it an argument retrospectively that we shouldn't have done it? I don't think so. There was a political inevitability to that, which was broadly accepted. And the same would go for EU membership for countries in the East that have become members of the European Union. I don't think anybody would argue today that we shouldn't have done that. But we clearly profoundly misunderstood the way this would be read in Russia. And maybe the failing there, if we want to say, was not so much that we did things that were misinterpreted by Russia. After all, that's not our fault. But that for many years, we simply didn't take Russia as Russia seriously. There was, I think, a tendency after the collapse of the Soviet Union, certainly in the United States, but also elsewhere, to lose interest in Russia. And maybe we simply took our eye off of developments there in a way that didn't help many years later.
Well, many now think that and NATO, that President Macron only a few years back said that it was brain dead, and the European Union are getting stronger and are finding solution even in the energy sector that they couldn't have found if this war hadn't happened, if Russia hasn't invaded Ukraine. Do you see that coming? I mean, do you see a stronger NATO and playing a leading role in the future, and also EU becoming more unified? We saw that even the problems with Hungary or Poland are now taking back seat.
Mm-hmm. Well, I do agree with that, and I think, of course, this is precisely what Putin was trying to forestall. It's had exactly the opposite effect. He's going to come out of this, as the Soviets used to say, with a worse correlation of forces than he entered the war with, which is an irony. But I think you're right. I think when President Macron was talking about NATO's brain death and so on, what he really meant, I think, what that was code for, was the fact that NATO had a lot of capacity and a lot of potential, but it wasn't the place where the big strategic issues of the day were being discussed. So there was a kind of disconnect between its military power and potential on the one hand, which was formidable, has been formidable, and the fact that decisions were being made and discussed elsewhere. And that's clearly not the case now. I think he even would probably admit that the crisis has focused minds in NATO in a way that really maybe surprised a lot of people. But this is not surprising. This is a hard security problem par excellence, and NATO is a hard security institution in addition to being a political institution. And I think something of the same thing has happened on the European side in a number of ways. Europe was already, in a sense, searching for a more active foreign and security policy role, partly because there was a fear that the United States would, over time, disappear or reduce its engagement in European security because it was dealing with China, or because we would have an administration in Washington, as we had in the Trump years, which simply was less interested in this Atlantic connection and its institutions. We don't have that at the moment, but we do still have this European interest in doing more in security and defense terms and in foreign policy terms. My own view is that the United States actually has come around to seeing that as an advantage. That if a more capable Europe in the world allows Europe to spend more, do more in defense, it's a more active partner for the United States, I think that's to Washington's benefit.
And my last question, I know it's very difficult to make that kind of predictions when there is a war going on, but do you believe that this war will last a long of time?
It's a very hard question. I think, it's a complicated equation because it operates at the military level, but it also, there's a strong political and identity component here. This, at the end of the day, what the terms of a possible settlement are also, above all, for Ukrainians to determine for themselves. I can imagine a situation in which the current conflict either reaches a stalemate or some sort of disengagement in a compromised fashion. So in that sense, that phase of the conflict might end or taper off. But the question of this much more difficult and threatening relationship with Russia will not go away. The only way I can imagine that changing is if there's a change of leadership in Moscow, which is an entirely different question. So barring that, I think even if the situation in Ukraine somehow stabilizes, we're still going to be facing, at best, a new Cold War with Russia. and that's a very dangerous situation to be in, but one that NATO and the European Union and all of us on a national basis will have to adjust to.
Dr. Leslie, thank you very much for this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.